Was the
It's always
The first-
formal, so
first
I
job at the
apologise in advance.
Welcome to another brown bag, but from somebody who has been a huge inspiration to me and many others who work on climate adaptation. Jokingly within our team, we call him Godfather of human dimension of climate change, because he's one of those persons who really brought not only the climate science, but what does it mean for life and livelihood of billions of people all over the globe. So it's a huge pleasure that we have Professor Neil Adger here speaking about his work, not only of past, but also his thoughts on the future of what climate adaptation should look like. And this is where this mission-driven adaptation to climate change that he will be sharing with us. It's an absolute pleasure and honor, Neil, to have that opportunity to listen to you before others. And before we start this talk, can I request the Deputy Director General, Isabella Coetzee, for the remarks. And thank you. I also have to say that our DZ, Dr. Prema Jain, so is here. Thank you so much for coming. I know that you have a very, very tight schedule today, but thank you so much that you're here. Over to you.
Thank you and good morning, and a very warm virtual welcome to all those joining us today online. Very warm welcome to Professor Neil Adger from the University of Exeter, along with the various partners that he's travelled with from the Success Project and the CLASPS project. And what we'd like to let you know is that Neil is no ordinary guest. He ranks among writers' top 20 most influential climate scientists and has played a pivotal role in shaping global climate policy as a senior author in the IPCC's 3rd, 4th and 5th assessment reports. His scholarship, including over 180 publications and the landmark article Vulnerability, has left a lasting impact on how we understand the human dimensions of climate change. And of course, I believe Neil and I met many years ago, but neither of us can remember exactly where, but of course I know of you and your work, and of course of Katrina, your wife's work as well. And I'm sure it was at DFID in those days that we met. But our ties, ICIMOD's ties, have deepened through the Success Project under CLARE, which is a UK-Canada framework research programme on climate adaptation and resilience. And University of Exeter is a valued culture partner with ICIMOD in that consortium, with Neil serving as principal investigator. So for us, this collaboration is far more than just research. It's really about elevating the lived experiences of mountain communities, grappling with the enormous challenges of adapting to very rapid climate impacts, whether by remaining in place or through migration. And let us not forget that these are communities who contributed least to the climate crisis. We very much appreciate this partnership, ensuring that migrant voices are heard on global stages, where it truly matters. And we hope that this partnership will continue to grow and sustain as we move forward. Thank you and welcome, Neil.
Thank you indeed, Isabella and Amida, for that kind welcome. It's an absolute privilege to be here speaking to you today. I haven't been here before. I don't know why not, but here we are. It's lovely to be here, and it's been fantastic to work with ICIMOD as a core partner in this work that we've been doing over the last couple of years on looking at effective adaptation and looking at the demographic realities of that putting adaptation in the context of people moving, of people not moving, the changing economic geography of the world, of urbanization, of many challenges that are going on, and looking at how effective migration could be as part of an adaptation strategy. But my thesis today is that all adaptation that we're going to do needs to be, if it's going to be effective, it's going to have to focus on the long term. It's going to have to set very, very clear adaptation goals and seek through investments and through interventions that may not look so good in the short term, that actually will in reality move us towards a more sustainable world that will be more where adaptation will be more effective within that. These ideas that we've got to ignore the short term and look at long term and set long term goals, and particularly the role of government in setting long term goals, allude back to the macroeconomics of a brighter age, I would say, to the work of Keynes and others in the mid-20th century that set the long term goals for development through global cooperation from the 1950s onwards. And these key ideas of Keynes and others was actually about the role of government, and the role of government itself in setting the scene and bending the market towards the will of the people, and put in rather abstract and idealistic notions. And so this is the idea that governments need to set missions, need to get consensus on the long term, and then move towards that. I think this is something that we need to make adaptation more successful, and I'm going to make a proposal around that. One way to do that, to have a mission within government, to make this one of the key things, is to have a Ministry of Climate Change Adaptation. So I'm going to use that device and see what would a Ministry of Climate Change Adaptation look like, and what would it do, and how would it move towards these long-term goals. First of all, I think we need one. We know that there is an adaptation deficit, to use the technical language that we use in the field. That we know that governments are not doing enough to look at the risks of climate change. There's evidence from this across the scientific community. We've written reports, but it's actually now filtering through to what governments are doing and what they're being held to account to do. This is just an example from Europe. It is a ruling by the European Court of Human Rights last year that the plaintiffs in this case were a group of women from Switzerland who said that their government, the government of Switzerland, was not doing enough to protect them from the consequences of climate change because of the physiological consequences of heat on elderly populations as a vulnerable group. The European Court of Human Rights held for the plaintiff in this case, and said that the government of Switzerland was not doing enough to protect its own populations. This is our landmark ruling. So through the judicial system, through legal processes on this, there are many other ways. But interestingly, what the European Court said was that the government then had a responsibility to mitigate climate change, to reduce emissions, to avoid this in the first place. And they also had a duty to protect their own citizens. This is one of the plaintiffs, with the famous advocate Greta Thunberg with them. And I think this ruling in the European context, so through the judiciary, through various processes, tells us that governments need to be doing more. And there's lots of other examples of how and why, and the consequences for action on what this adaptation deficit looks like. If the government of Switzerland or other governments wanted to set up a Ministry of Climate Change Adaptation to, in effect, meet its obligations to its citizens, the social contract that governments have to protect vulnerable populations, then what would it look like? So in this talk, I'm going to put forward what a terms of reference for a Ministry for Climate Change Adaptation would look like. I'm going to talk about how you would evaluate success, what effective adaptation looks like in that context, and then some other dilemmas that such a ministry would have. So how does government lead? Where do the private sector, where do communities, where do we, the role of government in actually leading this? Should this actually be a responsibility of government? To use our, more technical language, how to minimize others just leaving it to government, that's called crowding out, and how to maximize crowding in. So in other words, crowdsourcing or getting everyone else on board, community collective action, the private sector, various others this. And then how to build adaptive capacity. These seem to me to be the core functions of what adaptation looks like and what a government mission on adaptation would look like. Now, you might think there is not a single ministry for climate change adaptation anywhere in the world, and this sounds like a bit of science fiction, it's never going to come about. So let me make a case, first of all, that this may well come about. You may have read, or you may be stimulated by the science fiction of Kim Stanley Robinson and others that had a ministry for the future. Many of us in the room will have read this. That ministry for the future in that, parallel present world or near future world came about because of the crisis of climate risks in that fictional world. But when you read that fictional world, you think actually many of those risks are pertinent or are likely to come about. That ministry for the future, the title of this novel, was a function of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, so not a national ministry as such, but it sort of resonates, and it says that we need to look out for the future, and that's the role of government, to look out what the future does. We're underrepresenting the future in our governance structures, and we have some evidence for how this comes about and what to do about it. So democratic experiments in this sort of area have attempted to look at the future. So in Ireland, part of this has been through what are known as citizens' assemblies, and the National Citizens' Assembly in Ireland, which is a group of 100 or so randomly chosen individuals, doesn't make decisions, but deliberates on important issues for the future of the country. And when they deliberated on climate change in 2018, they set the course for what climate change policy could and should do within Ireland. But interestingly, at that time, at 99 participants, they were randomly selected from the population, and their process was to bring evidence to bear, to create a consensus around what should happen in a divisive issue. And this type of democratic experiment has made significant progress in other social arenas and social dilemmas in countries like Ireland and others where that's been tried. But interestingly, they only had 10 of the 100 participants were the age between 18 and 24. So there was some self-selection out, people volunteered, or when they were asked to be involved in this, they said yes or no. But Clodagh Rogers and others have actually shown that these sorts of processes underrepresent the future. One way to represent the future is to ensure that there is the next generation involved in this. And so in some senses, even these democratic experiments underrepresent the future and the foresight that younger participants have within it. Other sorts of ways to represent the future are more legislated. There are some countries around the world that have done this. The devolved government in Wales, as part of the United Kingdom, has this, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So a deliberate legislation, a deliberate process within government to take on board what the future might look like. This is a picture of the governor, the commissioner, as he's known, the future commissioner for the Commissioner for Future Generations. What a great title to have as your job. He's called Derek Walker. He scrutinises all legislation in the devolved government of Wales for its concern for the future and what the consequences of all their actions might be. But again, even he doesn't have policy making and doesn't have a budget. It's not standard ministry. It's scrutinizing the legislation of others rather than what a specific ministry would actually do. So although there are some experiments, democratic experiments at the margin of looking at future generations and making missions like adaptation to climate change real, we haven't quite got there yet. The other thing, of course, the other argument you might be thinking is, well, there's never been one, so there's never likely to be one. We don't have one in our country. But let me just say that these things change, and the demand for a climate change adaptation ministry may well come to the fore as the consequences of climate change become more real. This is again going back to the UK. UK was very quick off the blocks, the first country in the world to have climate change legislation in 2008, Climate Change Act, that mandated the government, national targets for decarbonisation. So the government, is in breach of the law if it doesn't decarbonise the economy, but also has obligations for climate change adaptation. But when that was set up in 2008, just after the Stern Review under a Labour government in the UK, it was called the Department of Energy and Climate Change. Then it was merged into the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and it's now the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. So there's absolutely no reason that not all government ministries are fixed. They change the focus. We set, once these things become urgent for a country and for a, in the context of crisis, these things do change. So there's my pitch of why we should have one, or how we could potentially have one, or in what circumstances. What would it do? Right. So what do we mean by mission-driven action in this particular case? Here we're going back to that idea that the government basically shapes the economy, that the government shapes society, and it is that innovation comes through what governments do, because we basically we level the playing field for markets, for civil society, for other things. And what governments do is absolutely central to how the world looks, what the economy looks like, and where that happens. And therefore, its role in all sorts of arenas, from demographic change through to the shape of the economy. The work by Mariana Mazzucato and others in this area, in macroeconomics, basically showed that the economics is pretty good at sort of identifying that markets are pretty good at identifying market failure, that we know that things, how to change things at the margin. And so, if we're decarbonising the economy and renewable energy, you can change prices, technologies get adopted. But the large-scale implementation of, for decarbonising the economy, the infrastructure that you need for renewable energy basically comes from large-scale government investment, that only governments have both the foresight, length of the legitimacy, and the sovereign debt that allows the long-term investments in things that change the playing field. So from those ideas in macroeconomics, I would say that what the mission for a climate change ministry of adaptation looks like the following. It needs to have clear sustainability goals. It needs to invest in public investments with measures of success that are holistic, that are really important, and it needs to have long time horizons. It needs to create incentives to leverage the private sector, and it needs to be synergistic with civil society and enable communities to do things for themselves. So that seems to me what the mission of what the evidence shows, that the types of principles that a ministry would actually look at. So in terms of reference for this ministry, might look something like this. Its objectives: to protect vulnerable populations from the consequences of climate change, that duty to protect, as we saw in the ruling from the European courts. protect future populations, not just present populations, and those parts of the world that are not represented in democratic processes, the natural world in particular, to build the resilience of populations, infrastructure and communities, and then to act collectively outside of jurisdictions to enhance the global adaptation through cooperation and solidarity. That seems to me, if you look at mission statements of what ministries do, they tend to be in these sorts of terms at this level of generality, but also importantly, sort of at this scale and ambition in terms of everything that a ministry does needs to be able to move us towards this mission. Three dilemmas then that I'll illustrate with some prior research about what this does and what we in our collaborations, in our research collaborations and Success and others can help, even if we don't have currently a ministry for climate change adaptation, of the dilemmas that governance has in actually making this happen. And these are three that I'm going to talk about, and there are others. How does such a ministry measure the outcomes of its interventions? So how would it know that it was actually on the right track? How does a ministry or interventions in this area leverage communities and get communities to help themselves and even to crowd in, as it's known, private sector action? And what constitutes in this area adaptive capacity and resilience? So how would we know that we were building resilience for the future? Good news is that these are the questions that over the last 20, 30 years have evolved particularly in the social sciences and in cross-disciplinary research on these topics. We've realized these are, that this is the evidence base that we need, that we're providing it at the margin for specific topics and for specific types of interventions. But actually this is the bigger picture, and if we can solve these, then we know that the mission to make it sustainable and to bring about adaptation will come about. So let me talk about the first of these for a little bit, and I'll go into research that I've been involved with myself in this. This is how you measure the outcome of adaptation interventions, or what should be the criteria for doing so. I think there's a realization that the consequences of climate change are not just on economic opportunities and on material well-being, but they affect absolutely every element of people's lives, their relationships with others and their relationships with nature. And so we need a way to be able to articulate that and bring this into a holistic framework. I think the health and the psychological sciences, human geography, various other disciplines have actually begun to realize this and work towards a set of metrics, if you like, for how to look at this. I've worked with this, in this case, with anthropologists and psychologists to look at the evidence of how we measure well-being, what well-being is, and how climate change is going to affect these different elements. And basically what we say is that climate change is going to affect directly, materially, elements of well-being on the left here, and the information that we provide and the signals that we provide on what future climate is going to do directly affect people. Then, of course, our policies and responses and adaptation actions also really affect well-being. What do we mean, or what can we say about what well-being is? The things, one way to think about it is things people care about, things that we all care about. And those include our personal health and the personal health of those around us, our sense of self, our self of identity and who we are as individuals, as well as our sense of belonging. So what our relations to the communities around us and our both historically and our responses for the future, our perceptions of risk and safety, and our perceptions of the places that have meaning and that have meaning for us. So from we can demonstrate all of these, from the psychological sciences. I have tried to articulate these and maybe we've never quite got to, you know, a sort of consensus on these, and there's lots of language, and maybe if you're coming from a different discipline, you're using these. But these are the core of what we mean by well-being, and it's more than material. And I think that any metric, any way of measuring the effectiveness of adaptation needs to take on board these wider elements. And a lot of these, let's just illustrate these by looking at health and personal risk and the perceptions of risk, both from the consequences of climate change and from interventions in adaptation. So in research that I've been involved in with the consequences of flooding on vulnerable populations, we see that these elements of well-being, all of them are directly affected by the trauma of being flooded in your home, the places that you are, and the places that you interact with others in. This has been documented over the last 10 years or so. There's been multi-method studies, emerging sort of levels of evidence from right across the world, including this region, about the consequences of flood, of heat, and many other weather-related risks, on how people feel, of how that trauma directly affects them. And these have long-term consequences on people's health. In this study, it was looking at the consequences of flood risk in vulnerable populations in lowland England, and it showed the mechanisms by which these dealing with floods actually led to changes in people's well-being. And that's actually about the feeling of loss of control, so lack of agency, a feeling of disruptive futures, that we don't trust what the future is going to do. These things can return, and various other things. And it also showed that actually that solidarity and collective action ameliorated lots of these risks, actually reduced them over time. And there were these multiple impacts on well-being well beyond the material, that levels of anxiety, stress, post-traumatic stress disorders and others are elevated in these, and that many of these consequences last over years following these types of events. But that actually communities doing things for themselves. This is a village in Somerset where the farmers got together and helped people who were flooded. This village that is pictured here had been cut off by these floods, winter floods, for about 2 months. No one could get in or out, and people just that solidarity actually, and those types of actions were the only thing that actually reduced the stress and led to lower levels of anxiety. People said to us, this was the worst time I've ever experienced, and at the same time, this was the best time I've ever experienced with my neighbours and the community and the rest of it. So those two things seem contradictory, but you can hold two thoughts in your head at the same time. So the consequences of climate change in terms of long-term health and in terms of these elements of well-being are very well documented. But what about the adaptation options? Those adaptations that we implement, do they also have these sorts of consequences? Because if we're going to reduce the risk through interventions, we need to understand what those interventions do in terms of these metrics of well-being. So in another study funded with lots of health researchers, funded by a medical charity and grant-giving body, we've been evaluating what these adaptations are for flooding. There's basically the three things that we do whenever we're faced in places that are significantly flooded all the time. Either move people away and suggest, actually, these places are just too risky, or we try to manage that risk by diverting rivers, by implementing upstream watershed catchment interventions upstream in watersheds to reduce flows and manage the risk and work with nature in these sorts of for these sorts of solutions, or we put in hard engineering. Of course, we tend to do all three in the same localities at the same time, but those are the three main interventions that we're looking at. And in a study, what we've done is actually try to look at where each of these are dominant and examples of where these types of adaptations are dominant, and look at the outcomes. I'll not go into too much detail on this. I've got lots of results and we're very excited about this. We're publishing these at the minute. But just to just say one, to reiterate about this idea of living with adaptation interventions, that we need to understand the consequences of these. And these consequences in terms of well-being involve how we feel. So it's an emotional response to these things. It involves our mental health and well-being and other social dimensions, disruptions to community, disruptions to the way that we interact with each other. It includes feelings of thinking that the world is not going to be the same again, that we're losing places that we find to be important for our own meaning, for spiritual connection and various others, a term that various anthropologists refer to as solastalgia. So this is a nostalgia for place and the feeling that these places have been violated. And also various other elements of psychological distress. And the findings, even from these flood studies and the rest of it, that actually these effects are long-term. They're not just about when interventions are first implemented. They are, these happen over time. So what we've done in this study is to look at places where these interventions have been implemented dominantly. These are hard engineering, solutions, nature-based solutions, and planned relocations and managed retreat away from places subject to flood risk. And our design is to look at these adaptation interventions, look at the consequences of those in terms of people, the process of people's lives, their health, their social and economic and environmental outcomes, and then to measure separately what that means for well-being. I'll skip through some of these results. I should say that these then are in different jurisdictional, governance and cultural contexts in Ireland and in England that I've talked about, and in Ghana and West Africa. So yeah, just to reiterate that, we looked at these types of interventions. We looked at the areas of life affected by living with these types of interventions. And then we looked at diverse well-being outcomes, which are quality of life, so how people feel about their quality of life, negative things like the prevalence of anxiety in these sorts of areas of living, living with flood risk and living with these interventions, and also what's known as positive and negative affect. This is emotional response to these things, positive emotions around pride, around positive well-being, and negative things around worry, concern, being scared, and those are what are known as things that we can measure, well-being outcomes we can measure, known as affect. Turns out that actually moving whole settlements and people out the way, the big circles on the right, that the majority of people that are involved in planned relocation, this is a major disruption to people's livelihood and well-being, as you can see by these elements: livelihood, insurance, family life, connection to community, access to nature, hugely affected if you move whole communities away. The only one on the right there that's that little orange block, that only 14% is actually to do with insurance. That wasn't particularly relevant in this case. Other flood adaptations don't have that effect, but interestingly, the things that people mention most often are the most frequent in terms of consequences, areas of life, are actually connection to other people and connection to nature, as you can see in those spider diagrams on the right in this case. But how do these affect? So these are the sort of consequences. There's ways to measure the consequences of living with adaptation interventions themselves. Yes, we measured positive effect and negative effect. This is a psychological metric known as PANAS, positive and negative affect schedule. And what you would want to see is that the distribution of positive emotional responses going up and negative ones going down. That would be a good outcome, wouldn't it? If people felt more, felt safer, felt less worried, felt more pride in the areas they were. And so you measure positive effect and you measure negative effect. And so what you want to see is one going up and the other one going down. And what we're not seeing is exactly that, apart from in the case of planned relocation, that basically says across the population that actually moving people out of harm's way in these particular cases that we looked at at the population level was pretty good. It is a pretty effective adaptation in just how people feel about the reduction in risk and their, and safety and the rest of it. However, even these types of interventions, whenever we look within the populations at who's affected, how they're affected, by, in this case, planned relocation, we see a slightly different picture. So this is just looking at the planned relocation work led by Mamuni Abu, a demographer at the University of Ghana, looking at these impacts on anxiety, well-being, and perceived safety of these communities that are actually some communities that have been moved away from the coast in Ghana in the Volta Delta region, and those that are actually still there. And what you can see here consistently is that the orange bar is higher than the blue bar, which basically means that the communities in this case that are not relocated tend to fare better than the communities that are relocated. This is kind of worrying signal in the design of these types of interventions that show that things like perceived safety, attachment to home, social identity, and even aggregate measures of well-being tend to be higher in those communities that are still living with risk and actually haven't been relocated. There's lots of stuff that we can do with these sorts of results to help design, make sure that the voices of people who are actually having to live with these interventions are made good and the rest of it. But I guess my main point here is to show that we have metrics and that we have ways to measure over and above simply economic dimensions and material dimensions of well-being to look importantly at people's perceptions on how they feel about these risks. There's always a danger of saying, well, that's just how people feel, they'll get over it, have it, and we get used to things and the rest of it. But let me say, on behalf of all the social scientists in the room, that perception is reality, and how people perceive the world around them affects their behavior, their investments, and everything else. So in this case, these are extraordinarily important ways to measure the outcomes of adaptation. Let me just finish with a couple of other dilemmas. The first then, and there's a lot of expertise in the room, and we're doing this in the context of interventions involving migration and the rest of it. How do we ensure that community-led adaptation actually comes forth? That is a pretty diverse sort of question, because a lot of community-led adaptation is about future risk. So it's anticipatory, to use our terminology in adaptation. It's looking to the future and doing things about it. And it's really important, I think, to enable to invest in communities understanding the risk, to perceiving the risk, and taking agency in actually planning their own futures. And a lot of that isn't necessarily about protecting people's homes. So this vertical axis, we're talking here that these are public goods, these are collective action benefits that we get from communities doing things for themselves. And then we also have to help people, or that there are communities are also doing a lot to actually help people, if we say it, sort of reactively, when we're faced with specific risks, disasters, heat waves, and the rest of it. And so those benefits accrue to individuals, not necessarily to communities, but it's communities that actually provide these sorts of services. So an absolute key for any Ministry for Climate Change Adaptation is to ensure that communities are empowered to do these things for themselves, because what adaptation investments do and missions can provide the infrastructure and the facilities for communities to do things for themselves. Let me just say a couple of words about the third dilemma that I highlighted, which is, do we know what adaptive capacity is, or how to build adaptive capacity? 20 years ago, if we'd been sitting in this room, and you may actually have been sitting in this room talking about adaptive capacity 20 years ago, we would have said it's to do with, standard sets of capitals, those familiar capitals that we have around, the ability of people to do things for themselves, human capital, physical capital, the sort of infrastructure, financial capital, and the rest of it. But I think the social sciences have risen to this challenge. I think that we know that those are only allow people to, the potential for these things to do. What we need to understand is individuals' motivations. And so this is just work by Michelle Barnes, currently at the University of Sydney, and her colleagues in getting to some of those other processes that actually constitute what adaptive capacity is at the individual and at the collective level. They look at the socio-cognitive processes as they refer to them. In other words, how people feel empowered to do things for themselves, not only to have that capacity but to organize. And so, as well as the assets in the top left, which would, if you like, are the 5 capitals, we also need, or we can build adaptive capacity by enabling people by enabling flexibility, to enable learning, to look at the organizational and the governance structure of how people actually work together, and to build agency. We're now understanding what adaptive capacity looks like in terms of the networks, the competences, and the capabilities that people have to actually do things, to build these sorts of things. I'll not take too much more of your time to go into the nitty-gritty of what we will be doing in this climate change ministry. So those are just 3 dilemmas. How do we measure the outcomes of intervention? How do we enable community-led adaptation? And what actually constitutes adaptive capacity moving forward? For any political scientists or anyone actually been involved in government in the room, of course, you're going to say, well, those aren't the real dilemmas. The real dilemmas are how to get buy-in, does this have any political will, these sorts of things. We absolutely understand this, and there's, and political scientists, those in public administration know these. Lack of integration, siloed policy, these are standard dilemmas for the implementation of government, but also issues around, for example, regulatory capture, so vested interests lobbying particular governments, the ability to build advocacy coalitions, to have parts of society, the private sector, to be in the same mission, to be acting in the same direction rather than acting to resist the actions that might be going on. And we can think of this in lots of different arenas, in water, in vested interests in agricultural development, in urban planning, and the rest of it. I'm not underestimating the dilemmas, and this is not necessarily idealistic a way to think about it. But I've made the pitch, and I've made the pitch not to say that this is the optimal way to do things, to have this. I've even invented a logo for it, what this Ministry for Climate Change Adaptation is going to do, but as a device to think through what the evidence that ICIMOD, us together, and the whole of the research community can bring to actually improving the governance of this, whether or not we have our own fantasy Ministry for Climate Change Adaptation. So thank you to my collaborators, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, I'll kick off. I was really struck by the middle part of your presentation when you were talking about all the different when you were talking about the different methods of measuring well-being.
Yeah.
And I was actually just thinking of some of our contexts here in the Hindu Kush Himalaya, and obviously the context is vastly different, and people's resilience is on a scale way above it, endorse it, because of the regularity with which these risks hit our mountain communities. But it would be fascinating to do something like this in selected communities in this region, to look at what kinds of effects are actually happening in terms of well-being. And it's such a shame that you don't have time, but just 4 hours down the road, you can go and see the Malamchi disaster, which you will never have seen anything on that scale before. And we went there 2 years ago and talked to some of the communities, and it's very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. Indeed, as we portrayed this, or as I portrayed this, a lot of this work that we're looking at in terms of well-being might seem a little abstract, and uses language that has that, if you like, is a consensus type of language across a whole set of disciplines to allow us to actually talk about this in a common manner. But I think what you're alluding to, Isabella, and I totally agree with you, that you can feel these things, and that we know that when communities are traumatized by weather-related extremes, that are thinking about the future, that have this, perception that things are changing around them, that place is changing, that they're concerned for the future, that these things are universal. They are manifest in cultural expression. They're manifest in, just ways people talk about things. And we're trying to formalize them here. We're trying to formalize them in ways that are hopefully that make these things legible for governance processes and for interventions that are common. And I think these are universal issues. I've illustrated them here with occasionally work in West Africa or in lowland South Asia and in Europe and the rest of it. But I think there is a commonality, a common humanity to these things, that are expressed differently. And I have absolutely no doubt that people in this region have high levels of resilience. But I have absolutely no doubt that these issues, that underlying this, having talked to people in all sorts of areas, that there is an underlying concern, an underlying worry about the future, and this creates an underlying stress. And I think you can see that stress in all sorts of manifestations and outcomes in communities. And I think we need to have common language. We need to but also look at the cultural context in which these things happen. So really great comment. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor. It was really insightful. There were a lot of good points around looking at long-term, having a long-term vision, long-term horizon, counting in, and innovations coming from the government. So, and there is, I work here on landscape portfolio and also on nature-based solutions. So it was just really good to see a bit of nature-based solution there. So I wanted to bring a question from nature-based solution as another narrative that looks into strategy for adaptation and resilience. So, Ministry of Climate Change, thank you for adding one more dilemma around coordination, intersectoral coordination, which is also a challenge for nature-based solutions. So my question is, how do we support government? Or, because they need to make it a mission, long-term mission. So government capacity to making this shift to see this nature-based solution as a long-term climate adaptation mission.
I think there's two roles. Thank you for that question. I think there's two roles really for science in this area, which is to articulate, to measure, and to demonstrate. To almost give a social license to governments to do, to see that this is an issue that they need to deal with, and that the population are concerned, that they have jurisdiction for, and we have advocates within, we have loud voices telling governments to do all sorts of things, and we have markets with vested interests. In the case that I brought up, because it's such a fantastic case, or a stark case, should I say, of the population of elderly women in Switzerland who are saying, you are not protecting us, and we can demonstrate the evidence, scientific evidence on the consequences on that vulnerable population that supported that particular route, of legislation, or the litigation, should I say, going through. So I think the role of science is to provide the evidence. So that's one issue. But you do come to a really important dilemma that's really evident in whenever we try to work with nature, and when we try to do that. that a lot of our systems in government are not set up to do that, not just because of intersectional or governmental, interdepartmental silos and that sort of thing, but also because nature is also invisible, or it does things that are not articulated or not evident in what we do. And again, I think the role of this sort of research is to highlight that nature, that all elements of nature that are manifest in place in people's real lives, and what they aspire to and what they value in the places around them, and using that sort of language allows us to promote those, or to provide evidence on the benefits of nature-based solutions. It's one of the expanding areas that psychologists that I work with really show, which is that if we're not, if we distance ourselves from nature, we lose something. We know that, but actually, even the exposure, the greening of cities, all the sort of greenery, all sorts of elements of what we might call nature-based solutions are actually incredibly important for people's well-being, right down to how quickly they recover from illness and all sorts of areas. So I think this interaction between nature and human well-being, particularly health, is a really fertile area to provide evidence to make sure that these things are taken forward in a sort of integrated way.
Well, thank you, Professor. It's an honor to have you here to speak to us on this very important topic. Now, my question is very basic, and I want to take advantage of your presence here as one of the leading climate change experts. There's always this debate about, where do we draw the line between mitigation and adaptation? And very often this features in the global dialogue, in the, even in the debate, investment debates. When you apply for adaptation fund, for something for adaptation, then there is always an excuse that this is probably mitigation. And when you do the other way around, again, same argument comes up. For example, electric vehicles, is it mitigation or is it adaptation? And also close to our world, the brick factories, brick kilns, are we contributing to the mitigation, scheme of things, or are we adapting to the situation? So we have been told sometimes this is an adaptation measure. Sometimes we've been told this is a mitigation. But in your definition, where would you draw the line?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think one of the reasons why, let me make the case against Ministry of Climate Change Adaptation, is that this is a false dichotomy between these two elements. And there is a danger in going down this route of it being siloed and the rest of it. I think we might look back historically at how we've dealt with climate change over the last 40 years and say, actually, that was one of the early mistakes that we made, of actually not seeing these things in a holistic way, of actually simply, diversifying and saying, there's one set of responsibility to move us away from this historic use of fossil fuels, which is only, let's face it, a couple of 100 years old, and it's a technological thing, and we will move to some other technology, versus how to deal sustainably, how to live sustainably in the world with a changing climate, with the loss of nature, with all the other environmental dilemmas. I think, I'll put my hand up and say I was part of probably all that, happening, or we as the scientific community love our typologies, and we typologize one thing as this and the other, and I think it is a mistake, and maybe we need a Ministry for Climate Change Adaptation, because I think when we have over the next few decades moved ourselves towards a trajectory of sustainable energy, I think that element itself involves the consequences of weather-related extremes, living sustainably in landscapes, and these sorts of things. So I know it's there, and it's an easy shorthand for us, But I think in terms of the governance, it probably doesn't make any sense to sort of look at these things separately, but look holistically at how we can change the landscape, or sorry, how we can change the investment landscape and the trajectory of economies, setting a mission to, we need to be decarbonised, and we need to include nature, you know, and be sensitive to nature, and we want communities and places to be resilient. So a place-based approach rather than a sectoral approach between adaptation and mitigation is probably the best way to do these things. But thank you for your question.
There is one question online.
Thanks.
So this question is from Aryan Jihan from IDRC. So his question, his comment is, what a wonderful presentation. I was struck and great to learn about planned relocation and its potential positive benefits. Perhaps you can elaborate on this regarding conditions in which this is likely to be beneficial, particularly as there are contexts of histories of relocation that are far from positive. Hence dependence on, say, quality of governance, question mark. Once again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Aryan. Nice to have people online speaking of this and the support of IDRC in doing this work. I'll talk actually about the work that we're doing within Success and CLAPS with ICIMOD and others. We're actually looking at both in India and Bangladesh, right, you know, at how planned relocation is actually being practiced at the minute. We know that that moving people really takes away their agency. We know that there is has a significant negative history in terms of people's rights, particularly human rights, in actually directly relocating people if they're without any consultation, without any process. But one of the things that we're coming to within Success and CLAPS is there's such a positive impact on people having homes that the reduction in precarity of actually providing people with homes who have been in fact homeless or made homeless through the consequences of river erosion, through floods and the rest of it, is such a beneficial step up for individuals. Might not be perfect, but that reduction in precarity is one of the really positive things that we're finding across Success and CLAPS in our work that's actually looking at these types of localities. And trying to take these more holistic ways of what that means for other elements of well-being, people's sense of community, place, that's also part of the challenge. But I don't think we can write off managed retreat, planned relocation, however you put it, on the basis of it hasn't worked well in the past. Because I think the consequences of climate change are coming down the road through all sorts of flooding in the highlands, through glacial lakes, in lowland areas, in coastal areas, and this dilemma about the redistribution of population away from places that will be in effect be uninhabitable. We need to grasp this, and we need to make sure that it's done in a sustainable and a way that is actually respectful and respects rights of individuals. So I'm not wholly positive about it, but I think it can be the process, the procedural justice, the outcome justice, and who gets access to these are key areas to look at how planned relocation comes about. And we're hoping within Success and CLAPS, with all our partners with ICIMOD and the rest of it, to actually bring forward some guidelines and some evidence to change the narrative, to bring out more evidence-based narrative about what what's actually going on the ground and how best to make it effective.
Hello, my name is Bipin Dulal. I work at ICIMOD as a disaster risk reduction analyst. Thank you for pointing out the impact on the vulnerable communities by flood and the well-being. But if we look into the prospect in Hindu Kush Himalaya, in many areas we see like the hazards are overlapping.
Yeah.
And not only the hazards, but the impacts are also overlapping on space and time. So for example, by the time a community tries to overcome the impact of a drought, they are hit by the flood. So the well-being curve fluctuates and actually declines.
Yeah.
And it is mentioned about the melon's impact. The same community was hit by earthquake few years before, followed by the flood. So they were not able to overcome the impact of the earthquake, and then the impact of the flood was there. So my question is, what kind of adaptation strategies should we look into when we deal with the cascading and the compounding and the overlapping of the impact? And how do we ensure the well-being of the communities when we deal with these impact overlapping? Thank you.
Thank you for that fantastic question. I mean, I think this issue of cascading or multiple interacting crises that people face, and almost the acceleration of these, or the increasing interaction, and people refer to it as polycrises, the rest of it, multiple overlapping cascading impacts, is hugely important. It's something I think that our research hasn't done well with, because we look in isolation. We're interested in floods, or we're interested in heat waves, or we're interested in, we're sort of driven by what those traumas might be, and looking at how long those last, what the impacts are, how stressful these are and traumatic these are for people, and individual strategies. But I think one of the more alarming elements of climate change research, as I read it and interact with climate scientists in this area, is the likelihood of these cascading or interacting factors. I don't have a good answer on how best to adapt to these, apart from the third dilemma, which is building adaptive capacity of communities to have agency, to plan for these things, to recover quickly. All the evidence suggests, or the evidence in the areas that we've been looking at, is that level of agency for communities doing it for themselves, vastly reduce the consequences, the negative consequences of well-being of individual events. People recover more quickly if they act collectively together. And so the key to this is not just simply governments providing infrastructure and the rest of it, but is enabling communities to have the capacity to help themselves, and to help themselves in place, being very important, for those facilities to be whether not necessarily in physical place, but those allowing people to do it in the places that have meaning for them, whether or not those are digital resources, whether or not that is direct cash interventions or whatever. So there's no easy answer to these polycrises, I think, other than enhancing the underlying resilience and the ability of communities to act collectively. I'll have to say one rider to that, of course, is that giving autonomy to communities is not an easy political, this is not a simply, an idealized solution, or, one that we don't recognize that the redistribution and the devolution of power within communities is not something that won't be contested. It's easy to say that, but the devolution of, as I say, political, democratic and economic power to smaller communities and regions is something of which those vested interests will always try to minimize.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for wonderful presentation, Professor. I have one question related to your dilemma of measuring the success of the interventions related to adaptation by the Ministry of Climate Change and Adaptation. I think given the nature of these adaptation interventions, they are very, context specific, and localized, and given the nature of the vulnerabilities that these effects generate, the success of a particular intervention today might not be the success tomorrow. So, and that has huge implications for investment decisions at a larger scale. Why did this ministry? It's that this ministry is the vision ministry. So how they're going to make the decision if there are so much uncertainty And today, like, we do a good evaluation and we do a good assessment of the success, and we show that this is the success at the moment, given the uncertainties related to, like, climate change. And you cannot guarantee the success will be retained and sustainable tomorrow. So what are your thoughts?
Well, thank you for raising that issue. I think it's hugely important. I don't have a solution to this. I think one way to articulate that in particular is the need for that governance and that long-term vision to engage in what might be old-fashioned called spatial planning, and to see that that the manifestation of lost climate risks are going to be manifest in particular places, particular climate zones, in watersheds, and the rest of it. And therefore, that long-term vision or long-term, long-term interventions that are going to be successful in the long term are going to have to be in places that are going to be, in some senses, sustainable, habitable in the long term. And that does raise some major issues around, because if governments signal that their investment decisions are in particular places, it can lead to capital flight and an acceleration of that de-investment from other sorts of places where that infrastructure is not being put up or being invested in. So I think it's a call for, I guess it is a cross-disciplinary, a multidisciplinary approach to show that it's that spatial dimension to it, that investing in places that are going to be sustainable over the long term is going to have the greatest, short-term return in terms of adaptation. Thank you.
Take 3 more questions and then
Neil, thank you. This idea is quite fascinating, and personally, I've been in India. I've been advocating for a department for internal migration for a long time. Now, the political commitment through a ministry make them accountable, make the state accountable. That is the most important aspect of it. Now, these political will or the way ministries function is influenced by the industries. And these industries are probably the key contributors of the, shaping the evolving climate-related issues. So how do we, in most of the dialogues, even if it is the case of social protection for the displaced population or migrants, in the dialogues, generally, the employers of the industry is not coming, who are people who are directly accountable for the exploitations. So how do we also make these industries accountable? And then how do we influence them to positively, otherwise what happens is they influence these ministry and then will take it to their requirements. So how do we address this dilemma?
Fantastic question, Benoit. Fantastic way of articulating one of the key, I guess, constraints on any government action, which is, although governments around the world are perhaps ranging from 20% to 40 or even 50% of the economy, they are the key, they are the key stakeholder. They have long-term vision and the rest of it. What happens with businesses or private sector interests that this might seem to diverge? I think one thing that the last month of global political economy has shown is that what the private sector really doesn't like is instability, or not knowing what's going to happen in the future. And therefore, I think the only way to bring along those sorts of actors is to have that is to demonstrate what those long-term goals might be, and the benefits for the whole of society, as well as for private interests in moving towards that, having the benefit that knowing that these policies are going to go forward in the future. And I think that's even the case if you had a department for internal migration, which is to show that the objectives for internal migration are to provide labour to redirect the economy, to increase skills or whatever that ministry would do. And then I think the more enlightened parts of the private sector that are through that enlightenment are likely to, you know, gain their own return, are more likely to come along with you. That's at least an idealized way of looking at it, that there is a vision for positive synergies between private and public sector actors. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Sagar Sharma from Kathmandu University. Thank you so much for your fascinating talk. Given all the questions and the comments you've made after that, just to follow up, you mentioned somewhere the consequences of inaction.
Yes.
And the communities that are having to face the anxiety and stress. You know, one of the dilemmas or the challenges we're facing in countries like ours is we might, I think, as well have a ministry of inaction.
Yes.
As you know, they just don't act. It's not like they're not aware of what might happen. We have annual, every seasonal things. Floods come and go, as you said. They come and go. They happen, and they become headlines. But we just don't see any concrete action happening.
Yes.
Also, perhaps at the global level, because the COP, look at the COP 29, 30, all these fiascos, and we've not really been able to come up with complete globally accepted measures.
Yeah.
So that perhaps my question, or just as a thought, is perhaps we don't know how to act, particularly local authorities, local governments. We don't know how to intervene. Yes, there is a need, but so the capacity to intervene effectively and invest, and I think is also equally important, not just about raising the adaptive capacity of the communities, but also the authorities to be able to intervene effectively. And I just wonder what your experience was that.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really fantastic comment about the levels of inaction. I mean, I think we need to understand why government ministries, and other elements of the public sector don't act, and a lot of it is risk aversion. Like you really get hauled over the coals for if you do things and they go wrong, and therefore there's big incentives in all our systems not to do anything, because that's the safest thing to do, the safest for your election, for your political reputation, for your litigation against you, and these sorts of things. So I think this is another reform of government about the ability to take risks, to be innovative, to learn from mistakes in the past. And I guess this is another real role that social science in particular can play to provide the evidence of what works and what doesn't work, and to allow government ministries to find out what's going on in other contexts, in other jurisdictions, in other countries, and actually learn from that and just get over this inaction for fear of making a mistake. And I think we're all risk averse like that underlying, aren't we? We don't like conflict. We don't necessarily want to take risks where we're exposing ourselves. But it's a great comment and question. And I think your question, most of the others here, have absolutely highlighted every potential dilemma of if we had a Ministry of Climate Change Adaptation, how difficult it would be. So I'm not putting it forward as a panacea, but as a potential way to think through of the dilemmas that we have. So thank you.
The last one, and then it's closing.
Hi, Neil. So I'll try to make this as short as I can.
Thanks.
So we've been talking about the government taking initiatives in terms of long-term adaptation, but I think my question would align to a lot of other questions asked in terms of individual initiatives and efforts that we could make, and the long-term adaptation, because the stressors are still here. It still exists, that is hinting at the long-term adversity that might be caused by these particular stressors. For example, there's still emissions happening. As Benoit said, there's a lot of factories and that are at the risk of not shutting down because of the massive industrialization, right? And there are also people that are just now starting to realize about waste management, and yet it's not really sustainable, and they've just started out. It might take a lot to catch up pace with the other sustainable practices that is happening globally. And the next thing is about digital waste that are still leaving traces of adversities, and that might head to the future with us, with the future generation. So considering all this, what would the immediate steps or strategies, adaptation strategies should look like, so that, or something that we should do immediately so that the future generation can rest a bit more peacefully, or like it can go and be adapted into the future generation as well, maybe something that we could do immediately?
I absolutely have no solution to that dilemma whatsoever. I mean, I did highlight some experiments to how we take that long-term vision into the future. You know, do we put that to one person or one institution to say, right, for everything we do, make sure that we look at the long term, or do we look at younger generations and say, you're the ones going to be living this. I say this to all my students. You're the ones going to be living with this. You have the longer term vision. And it is very much a cross-generational bargain. What we do affects us, but it also affects future generations. I think, and again, this is, I'm making the case on behalf of the social sciences. I think we need to experiment with these ways of thinking about the future. We need to look at what works, what doesn't work. And we also need to have that representation of non-represented parts of the world, parts of, in geopolitics, but also who speaks for nature. How do we take these longer term and non-representational elements into account? Political philosophers, political scientists, who've been working on experimenting these things. We need to harness all these different disciplines and different ways of actually thinking about this to help these, really just everyday issues that governments and governance is faced with, which is, we're doing it now, it's short term, we're avoiding risk, we're just doing what looks good on paper. That's the whole thing about sort of having a long-term vision, or having a democratically accountable long-term vision, but then really sticking to it and doing that sort of thing. So thank you for that. Another great dilemma that would need to be faced.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We have run way over time, but it was such an interesting discussion that I just didn't want to cut down the questions. Thank you so much, Neil. That was such wonderful thoughts that you have provided for all of us moving forward. I'm sure each of us have taken some inspiration from this. I'm definitely interested, if not ministry, then at least the Department of Climate Change Adaptation. That's going to be critically important in this part of the world. So thank you so much for that. And as a token of appreciation, may I present this to you? This is a new thing. I also have not seen them.
Well, thanks so much. Thanks, Amelia. I have a million photographs more trip to Bhutan with Amelia in the last week or so, but this will be added to. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, colleagues who have joined virtually, for joining in and listening in. Thank you.